Okay, so here we are. Good morning or good afternoon, everybody, depending on where you are, and happy Pakistan Day, everybody. We managed to inadvertently schedule our webinar on a public holiday in Pakistan, but good news is that socialprotection.org has a YouTube channel where we can watch things in catch-up. So that's where you can find these webinars if you miss them in the future. I'm here to give you a brief introduction on this webinar today. So this is the third webinar of our Shock Responsive Social Protection Systems webinar series with socialprotection.org. And this is a webinar series which focuses on two-year research which we've been conducting, financed through DFID's Humanitarian Innovation and Evidence Programme, and aimed at strengthening the evidence base on when and how social protection systems can better scale up in response to shocks. And we're actually coming up to wrapping up this research. We've finalized our case studies, and we're now starting to synthesize across what we've been finding in all of these countries, which is very exciting. And you will actually be hearing from some of the evidence from two of these countries today. Our partners on this two-year project are it's being led by Oxford Policy Management, partnering with ODI, the Cash Learning Partnership, and INASP. And what I'm going to be doing now is introducing our presenters briefly, and then giving you just a little bit of background, conceptual framework for the project and links to resources. So I'm Valentina Barca, and I'm from our Poverty and Social Protection portfolio here at OPM, and my key focus is on how delivery systems, social protection delivery systems, can facilitate responsiveness and effectiveness of social protection systems. And I've recently started supporting this this project in its final phases of synthesis. Our presenters today will be Carol Watson, who's an independent consultant who's led our country research in Pakistan, and she's also co-led our regional Sahel study. She's former UNICEF staff, worked there for 20 years in a variety of different positions, and has quite extensive experience working on social protection policy, including developing strategies and policies in Niger, Mauritania and Chad, and conducting beneficiary assessments in a number of other countries. And it's with great pleasure that we've had her on board with our team. She will be presenting our Pakistan case study today. We then have Gabby Smith is also an independent consultant who's got experience across the spectrum of the two topics we'll be looking at today, so social protection and humanitarian programming. She's been technical advisor with Concern Worldwide. She's worked on several different projects. She's worked extensively with the Cash Learning Partnership, and she has supported the design and delivery of multi-sectoral humanitarian assistance in a number of countries with a specific focus on the use of electronic payment systems. So now I'm going to quickly give you just a bit of background on why we're looking at this link between kind of how social protection, kind of long-term assistance, can become more shock responsive and basically bridge the gap with the humanitarian system. We know that shocks, if they lead to a crisis, can be very costly, both in terms of development and in terms of financial costs, and that humanitarian systems can spend a lot of resources responding to recurrent long-term crises that might be more efficiently addressed through a country's social protection system. So what our study did kind of in the very initial phases was build on existing research to build a, if we can go to the next slide, a framework as to 5 different ways, channels through which social protection systems could contribute to a response at a time of crisis. we're actually in the phase of slightly adjusting these based on the outcomes of our research, but the 5 typologies that we introduced at the very beginning were the possibility for vertical expansion, so increasing the value or duration of a benefit for existing recipients of long-term social protection, horizontal expansion, so increasing the number of beneficiaries in the event of a crisis, piggybacking, so an external organization piggybacking on an existing systems and programs infrastructure, shadow alignment, so a humanitarian system kind of running parallel to a social protection program, or refocusing existing response to a different group of people. And what our case studies will be doing today is seeing to what extent some of these channels are possible and to what extent they've actually happened in these in the Philippines and in Pakistan. So if we go to the next slide, before I hand over to the panelists, I just wanted to briefly give you an overview of what's already there in terms of our research. The case studies were on Mali, Mozambique, Lesotho, Sahel, and Pakistan and Philippines, which we will be presenting today. Mozambique, we've already discussed in another webinar, which is available on sp.org's YouTube channel. The project website I've put a link to here, and you can find links to every single resource that's been produced through this project there. There's also an online community that we host on sp.org, and we invite you to become members if you're interested in this topic, because in the long term this is where the discussions will continue. There's the working paper on conceptualizing shock responsive social protection systems is possibly the best place to start from to look at the overall framework that has informed all of the studies going forwards. I've also put links to the previous webinar and to the literature review on this. So one last thing before I hand over to the panelists. This is an open webinar, as in you're warmly invited to send your questions kind of while the panelists are talking, and we'll be taking note of these, and then I'll be posing the questions to the panelists at the end of their presentations. So please do submit questions using the GoToWebinar chat bar. So I'm pleased to hand over to Carol now. Thank you very much.
So just getting myself situated. Hello, everybody. It's very nice to be here with you all, even though I can't see you. And thank you for the introduction, and also thanks to all of you for joining. I'll be presenting the key research findings emerging from our country study in Pakistan. Next slide, please. Just to go over a bit what we're actually looking to find out in this global study, it's really to strengthen the evidence base around how social protection can effectively adapt or scale up in the event of a large aggregate shock or crisis. And as Valentina said in her introduction, to sort of minimize the negative impacts and also reduce the need for a large-scale humanitarian response. And our key research questions were therefore around what features in the design and implementation of social protection systems offer effective response to shocks. And a second key research question, how can the humanitarian, disaster risk management, and social protection systems and sectors work together for more effective responses to shocks? And I think both of those are equally important, because we know it's not just in the design of a particular program, but it's in the sectoral nature of the world we live in, where programs come out of different, sometimes silos, sometimes more open systems that can be more integrated. And these were the two sort of twin questions that we were pursuing. Next slide. What was the focus of our research in Pakistan? And this is what our presentation will provide you with a briefing on. First, we overview the numerous shocks that Pakistan is subject to, as well as the different levels of vulnerability among different population groups. Then we analyzed the institutional and policy context for both social protection, disaster risk management, and the humanitarian response system, including, interestingly, in Pakistan, in the context of devolution, the decentralization of many of these functions to the provinces, which adds a particular contour to the institutional issues in Pakistan. We then review the lessons learned and challenges from the variety of experiences in Pakistan of cash-based responses to disasters, whether it's earthquake or drought or floods or temporarily displaced populations due to conflict. There has been this rich experience in Pakistan on cash transfers, which is what we will focus on in our presentation, and what we focused on in our study, although we know that there are other kinds of responses. We've analyzed a bit the budget and financing the fiscal space for social protection and disaster risk management. And then we zoom in on a closer look at the national flagship social safety net program, which is the Benazir Income Support Programme, which we refer to as BISP. And see to what extent that has or can serve as a platform for shock responsive social protection and response to these aggregate shocks. And we end with some perspectives on the larger coordination, synergies, and the future scenarios for shock responsive social protection, drawing on the research typologies that Valentina outlined at the outset. Next, please. So we know Pakistan, as many places, is at high risk of covariate shocks. And here we have a map. They've done quite a lot of multivariate hazard and risk mapping in Pakistan. You have a map showing the intensity of different kinds of shocks in different parts of the countries. We have natural disasters ranging from floods to droughts to earthquake, of course. We all remember perhaps the earthquake in Asia, the earthquake of 2005, landslides, avalanche, and tsunamis. And on average, around 3 million people per year are affected by such natural disasters, with damages and losses rising to more than $18 billion over the past decade. And within these natural disasters, around 3/4 of the people who have been affected by floods. You have the Indus Valley region there, which is subject to periodic flooding and therefore disaster. Pakistan is also highly prone to armed conflict and civil unrest, particularly in some parts of the country, such as Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and the federally administered tribal areas, or FATA. In 2015 alone, there were more than 1.8 million displaced. These people are called, in contrast to some places where they're called IDPs, internally displaced population, they're called temporarily displaced populations, or TDPs, and there are a number of programs underway to deal with their needs. And these two main types of disasters or shocks play out on a backdrop of prevailing poverty and vulnerability. In terms of monetary poverty, the latest figures are about 30% of the population affected. It's even higher in terms of the multidimensional poverty, 39%, which measures deprivation along access to services such as health or education or living standards. We see that there are significant disparities both between provinces and within provinces, so highly unequal and disparate kinds of population groups, and high levels of social exclusion and gender inequality. This has been recognized in Pakistan in terms of the link between poverty, shocks, and vulnerability. It's seen that poverty and social exclusion can affect a household's likelihood of being exposed to shock, as well as as well as its ability to deal with a shock and the impacts on household welfare. There are national policy guidelines in place on vulnerable groups in disasters that have come out of the Gender and Child Cell of the National Disaster Management Authority that recognize that disasters can have differential effects on different kinds of individuals, groups, or categories. And lessons from previous emergencies have shown that national disasters can result in specific challenges and can exacerbate existing problems in terms of the safety and security of specific categories of population, such as women, people with disabilities, and the like. So this link between poverty, vulnerability, and both exposure to and impact of a shock is very strong. Next. In our analysis of the institutional and policy context, the first thing we note is that as a result of the process of devolution, which came about through the 18th Amendment to the Constitution in 2010, the bulk of social protection and disaster risk management functions have been now devolved to the provinces. And this, of course, has significant implications for both budgets as well as the implementation of programs and coordination among different programs. Within the social protection field, there is a national social protection policy framework that has been developed by the Planning Commission and is currently undergoing formal approval, which was set for this month, actually. This is sort of a framework because of the devolved nature, so it's to be enacted in correspondence with provincial policies and programs. And it identifies some particular shock responsive measures to natural disasters, environmental groups, risks, conflict. It also recognized victims of natural disasters, internal conflicts, and IDPs as priority vulnerable groups. So in the very policy itself, there is an opening, a policy opening towards shock responsive social protection. We see that in the reviews of the social protection system, there's really no single agency responsible for social protection in Pakistan, which leads to certain problems. There are three main social safety nets, which these are the largest and the most solidified safety nets in Pakistan. It's the Benazir Income Support Programme, the Pakistan Baitul Mal, and Zakat, which is, of course, the Islamic system of charity and assistance. These are the main social safety nets, although there are many others, and there are disparate examples of different safety nets, different programs operating at different levels and in different provincial settings. And the main observation that most analysts and that we ourselves in our analysis of the situation have come up with is that there's really a lot of overlap, duplication among these dispersed programs, and missed opportunities for coordination, as well as now the issue of coordination or coherence between the national policy framework and the provincial level programming. In terms of the disaster risk management institutional framework, this really was developed after the 2005 earthquake with the establishment of the National Disaster Management Commission, the NDMC, which is the apex body for disaster DRM in Pakistan. The operational body is the NDMP, which is the National Disaster Management Authority. You have those at different levels then with the provincial and the district level management authorities. And you have a national disaster management plan that guides the whole effort. This is now the architecture in place, but it is still quite nascent. There's severe capacity gaps in manpower and in technical capacity at different levels, and particularly down at the district level, where you find that district authorities are really, fulfilling many duties and responsibilities among their portfolio of responses, so you don't have a specific structure there. In terms of the humanitarian system, there's been humanitarian response through the UN system, the Interagency Standing Committee network, which was first activated in Pakistan in response to the 2005 earthquake. And you have a number of very influential and efficient NGO networks, including the National Humanitarian Network, which is a network of national NGOs, as well as the Pakistan Humanitarian Forum, and many of these actors, along with other partners, UN, bilateral, government, are linked together in a cash working group that's been developed and is active as well in Pakistan. This humanitarian response kicks off through an appeals process when the needs surpass the capacities of the national authorities. And again, this started out after the 2005 earthquake. Within this structure of the three sectors or systems, there's really no established mechanism for coordination among them between the social safety net systems and DRM, and it contributes to some missed opportunities for linking on and establishing synergies between social protection and disaster response. Next. In terms of some of the budget and financing issues, our analyst, and I meant to mention the Pakistani team because we had sorry, I meant to do this earlier. We had a number of specialists, the team members. I was the lead for this. We have a national staff member of OPM itself, based in Pakistan, Tanya Lone, who is working with us. We have a disaster risk management specialist, Usman Qazi, from Pakistan, also working with us. Gabby Smith, who will be later presenting the Philippines study, was also working with us and is able to present some comparative perspectives between Pakistan and Philippines. And Faisal Rashid, also an OPM staff member in Pakistan, who is a specialist on budget and financing issues, who is helping us with the budget and financing analysis. And his analysis showed that really the public sector spending on both social protection and DRM has remained well below 1% of GDP over the past 5 years, while fiscal trends show rather proactive, credible and growing funding for social protection, particularly for the Benazir Income Support Programme, which shows an annual growth of 22% in financing. The funding for DRM remains generally reactive. It's mostly responsive. Less goes into the preparedness and the protection aspects of it. And there's still issues of budgeting between the federal level and the provincial level, where provincial governments really need more resources in order to be able to respond to their mandates to deliver services. There's a need to create, therefore, more fiscal space for both social protection and disaster risk management, and there's a number of ways this can be done: higher revenue generation, moving resources from untargeted subsidies towards more targeted programs, drawing in private sector initiative, working out some of the disputes that remain as a result of the devolution of responsibilities and fiscal capacity. And nevertheless, within this situation, there are very innovative things that are happening at provincial level. For example, in Punjab, which was an area, we went to 2 provinces in our research, went to Punjab and Sindh. And in Punjab, there are a number of specific social protection programs that have been developed and are being implemented by the provincial governments. In Punjab, they have a very well-developed khidmat card, which focuses cash transfers and support to vulnerable groups, including people with disabilities. They're moving towards the development of asset risk insurance, for example, crop insurance, so that there are a number of really innovative activities that are taking place within budget constraints as well in Pakistan. And as part of our recommendation in the study is that the need for the development of a national disaster risk financing strategy that would support and uphold the disaster risk management plan. And there are a number of options that we've looked at in our report that could possibly be pursued. Next. If we look at what we find is quite unique in Pakistan among the country case studies, this history of cash-based responses to disasters, you see here from the earthquake in 2005, there was the earthquake response kicking off into a livelihood program in 2006, a housing program as well, internally displaced peoples program in 2009. These are again in some of the northern territories and areas. In 2011 or 2010, after the floods, there was what we call the CDCP, the Citizen Damage Compensation Program, and the One Card, which was really developed as a flood response program. We have other kinds of provincial level packages in Punjab in 2013 and 15, and then in the federally administered and tribal areas to respond to the needs of the displaced populations, displaced to conflict and insecurity in 2016. So there's been really a very, very rich experience over the years in cash transfers. These have been mainly led through the DRM sector, so through the disaster risk management, and less through the social protection sector. There was an attempt by the Emergency Relief Cell, the ERC, at the time to develop an action plan around cash responses to emergencies. That exists, but it was never really implemented, although the national authorities are now looking at how this can be revisited and revised. And at a recent workshop that was led by the National Disaster Management Authority and OCHA, the UN Organization for Humanitarian Assistance, there was a workshop on cash responses to emergencies, which had some very useful recommendations which parallel some of our findings and the recommendations we came out with. The need to establish maybe a platform for dialogue among the key stakeholders to really assist with coordination, develop some national policy guidelines, a national technical task force, and to center all this within a review of the response plan. Next. Drawing on some of the lessons learned, particularly from the CDCP, the 2010 flood response through the Citizens Compensation Program, what have been some of the key lessons learned? That it is possible to leverage existing government institutions and public-private partnerships to institute large-scale cash transfer programs for both relief and early recovery phase. Here, Pakistan was really well served by building on the civil registry that's maintained by the National Database and Registration Authority, NADRA, which is a key institution in Pakistan responsible for providing citizens with their computerized national identity cards, or CNICs, and which has also a project component which has actually allowed it to implement some of these cash transfers in the past. There was also some lesson that we really need to build around surge capacity of institutional partners. Not all partners are equally strong. This needs to be assessed and sort of partners pre-positioned with the technical support and resources needed, particularly at subnational level, to respond to large-scale disasters. The issue of combining geographic targeting with other poverty and vulnerability criteria is really a key issue and lesson that arises from some of the difficulties that arose during the flood response. The idea of, as we know with any kind of response, robust communications and grievance systems. This national level computerized database really has served well its purpose, and how can that be then therefore expanded and extended and used during national disasters? Of course, infrastructure breaks down in a national disaster, so the ongoing program response and cash assistance needs to take into account there might not be any ATM machines, or the banking structure or the physical infrastructure might have collapsed, so the need to factor that into the cash response. And that technological innovations, as was first piloted in the CDC program, such as the use of debit cards, can enhance the efficiency of delivery, provided that the ATMs are accessible and that beneficiaries, primarily women, are guided on their use and have the mobility to be able to actually use these. Next. The Benazir Income Support Programme is, as I said, the flagship social protection covering nearly 5.3 million people, and it offers on a poverty-targeted basis around $45 a month to adult female beneficiaries of the households. Its main objective, it started in response to the economic downturn in 2009-10, is to reduce the poverty and inequality by providing consistent support to chronically poor and highly vulnerable. It's the national safety net program that is implemented through provincial structures of BISP, but it's still a national government program. It's not a provincial program. The coverage has been increasingly been expanding, as have the budgetary allocations, and a recent evaluation by OPM in 2016 has noted a number of positive impacts, including a drop in poverty and enhanced empowerment of women. So it's really one of the most evidence-based and successful and strong systems-based approach to social protection in Pakistan. Next. Some of the design features that are interesting to look at are the targeting based on a 2011 national survey, which led to the creation of a social registry, a national socioeconomic database, which covers at the moment around 85% of the population, within which a subset are those who fall under a poverty targeting criteria as BISP beneficiaries, but beyond that cover more people, and they are now updating that, that they are doing a new survey to update the database and cover even a wider population up to 95%. The eligibility for the program are all poor households. They have to have their computerized national database, and it's the married or previously married woman who is the beneficiary. Some of the positive developments around BISP, that it's increased the take-up of the card, the computerized national identity card, which really is helpful in humanitarian assistance programs. And the database, the NSCR, the National Socioeconomic Database, can be shared with other agencies for other types of programs. Some of the challenges that are being confronted now is including more households in the database, updating the database, trying to account for the dynamics of poverty, households moving in and out, and continuously registering new beneficiaries. The payments are delivered quarterly through a range of financial service providers, the majority through debit cards managed by 6 partner banks. They've become more regular over the years with less leakage. Smart card and mobile money has been piloted, but they're still thinking that the debit cards are the best, with consideration of moving towards a cardless e-payment system based on biometric verification. Next. This is just a recap of the typology that Valentina set out at the beginning, that in the next slide we'll apply to Pakistan. Before we do, we see that BISP has experience in their scale-up to covariate shocks in the past, which, as we see, do more or less correspond to some of these ways that we've conceptualized within our framework that social protection systems or safety nets can be scaled up. In the earthquake, there was a cash, in Balochistan, there was a cash top-up to existing BISP beneficiaries, which is therefore an example of vertical scale-up. In the displacement in the federally and tribal administered areas, there was a provision of cash assistance to temporarily displaced populations by BISP, which is a sort of a piggybacking on existing systems. In response to flooding of 2010, along with the CBMC program, there were cash top-ups to BISP beneficiary families, so again, a vertical scale-up. In response to a bomb blast in Balochistan, which is one of the most unstable provinces in the country, there was temporary enrollment of those affected into BISP, which is an example of horizontal scale-up. And in the drought in Sindh province, there was also a vertical scale-up through top-ups to BISP beneficiaries. So there are existing experiences. These are BISP itself does not have the mandate for shock response per se. It deals more with chronic poverty, but it shows that it had experience and it has some kind of earlier lessons learned from these responses. Next. So if we look now in terms of opportunities and challenges, and we look for using BISP not necessarily so much always as a program, but some of its operational operating systems and some of its infrastructure as a platform for scaling up or adaptation in response to these large covariate shocks. What are some of the opportunities and challenges? We had a lot of very interesting discussions at country level on these various options. In terms of vertical expansion, we've seen that this has already been done. There have been top-ups to existing BISP beneficiaries, for example, in the aftermath of some previous disasters. It's one possibility. This is with the rationale that the BISP beneficiaries are already among the most the poorest and the most vulnerable, and so they would need these top-ups in the case of shocks. This, however, if this is the only action that's done, it leaves out of consideration those who are not BISP beneficiaries and who are equally affected by the shock, and therefore you would still need an additional disaster response to complement the BISP top-ups of the BISP program per se. Horizontal expansion of BISP as a program would also be possible, expanding the benefits beyond the additional ones to cover all of those who are in the disaster-affected areas on a temporary basis. This would, of course, require quite some strong communication measures to explain what's happening, not to raise expectations that this is an ongoing participation in or BISP as a beneficiary forever, that this is a temporary basis, and to reduce fraud. There was some feeling among our key informants in Pakistan that this might not be politically acceptable, also in the context of devolution, where provinces themselves are responsible for disaster management and social protection, and BISP as a federal program would therefore be more or less taking the place of the provincial governments. Let me skip down on the chart to shadow alignment. There is some significant experience to date in these cash-based response to emergencies basically through the DRM system, which can be considered as a form of shadow alignment. There would be, if this is one option that's pursued, you'd need to build in stronger coordination structures between the social protection system and the DRM to make sure that those positive synergies are created. And to go then to the second to last, that piggybacking, this seemed to be the option that most of our key informants and in our consultation seemed to see was the most pertinent for in the Pakistan contrast, to really leverage those existing systems that BISP has built up through the National Socioeconomic Database, NADRA, as both a program implementer, but also in charge of the national registration system, the existing payment mechanisms, to leverage those to reach caseloads on a temporary basis by other agencies. So it's not so much BISP as a program itself that would need to reach the other disaster affected, but BISP, the operating systems that could be leveraged. And in our next slide, we see a very interesting action research program that was undertaken of the potential for piggybacking in Pakistan by the IRC, the International Rescue Committee, which tried to look at pre-positioning the NSER database as a means of developing a scalable model to improve the cost and time efficiency. So what would happen if you had that the NSER database in place? How would that affect the time and the costs of rolling out a disaster response? What they found in a small-scale pilot run in Sindh province was significant time gains in targeting. It really cut the targeting time in half compared with the normal community-based targeting that would have been conducted. They had marginally lower costs that could likely be further reduced if all those standard operating procedures for how you actually share the database were already in place. There were equal levels of user satisfaction and significant reduction in the time, the community costs and lost income through using pre-positioned database rather than calling on community members to identify those affected. There was a follow-up that also had very strong positive findings, so to support this option of piggybacking in Pakistan. Next. On my last slide, just to, we know that we need to go beyond the sort of the program-based, even if it's looking at the operating systems of a program, to see what needs to be done to achieve some of those broader systemic linkages. And there's a number of ways you can do that, looking at the DRM cycle from preparedness to response to recovery, but also from looking at the common social protection framework, the so-called 3P framework of prevention, protection, and promotion, and looking at those as a sort of a continuum of what you can do within both of those sectors to increase the preparedness. For example, just taking one example, DRM is also doing, the DRM sector in Pakistan is already doing a lot around hazard mapping, risk and vulnerability assessments, that kind of pre-positioning of that vulnerability lens into the National Socioeconomic Registry, and applying that, pre-positioning it for shock responsive social protection is also a sort of the preparedness aspect of what you would need to set up and set in place to be able to hit the ground running in case of a disaster, and so on down the line of response and recovery and reconstruction. Of course, this idea of achieving the broader systemic linkages and coordination is one of the key challenges that's faced within Pakistan, both between the sectors and, as we've seen, between the national and the provincial levels. So it's clear that any move towards moving on towards shock response and social protection would need to work at various levels at the same time. And just to summarize at the end, therefore, some provisos. Next slide. We say that it is potentially feasible to make the linkages through the BISP operating systems. But we know that this will entail in every case a clear analysis at the outset. It's not always that this will be an appropriate response. There will be a need for more coordination, and that this does not remove the need for standalone humanitarian systems, that shock responsive social protection is still one of several response options. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us. This is Gabrielle Smith. I'm going to present for you today the findings from the Philippines case study. This is the other middle income case study in the OPM research, and it's also the other Asia case study in the research. Can I have the first slide, please? So in the case of the Philippines, they've actually experimented with using their social protection system to respond to a humanitarian disaster following the super Typhoon Haiyan in 2013. So this case study provides you with an illustration of shock responsive social protection in action. And despite the fact that each country case study is different, I think what you'll see as I go through is that some of the findings and conclusions from this study are similar to what you've just heard from Carol in the Pakistan context. And because this was a light touch case study, we're not mapping here all of the different possible social protection programs in the country. We were focusing very specifically on analysing the experiences of scaling up a particular social protection program at the time of Haiyan, which was the Pantawid Programme, and then analysing the constraints and enabling factors, and looking beyond the disaster in 2013 to any actions that have taken place since then to institutionalise shock responsive social protection in the context of Philippines. Next slide, please. So if we look at disaster risk in the Philippines, the country has particularly high vulnerability to disaster. It's in the top 5 most disaster affected countries globally. 74% of the country's population, 60% of the land area are susceptible to multiple natural hazards. So climate related hazards and also earthquakes. And it's typhoons particularly which are the worst in terms of the number of people that are affected and the economic losses. Climate change is expected to lead to increases in the intensity of future storms, and what we've seen over the last 3 decades is that the number of such natural disasters has been increasing, and they've also been affecting more people. You know, the intensity has increased as well. It's worth pointing out that the region of Mindanao in Philippines also continues to face a particular type of social political hazard due to the ongoing long-term conflict from the insurgency in that region. This wasn't the focus of our study. We were focusing on, you know, the natural disaster aspect. Next slide, please. So if we take a look at poverty and vulnerability to shock in the context of Philippines, there's the table on the left which introduces the poverty incidence statistics for the country. We see that poverty reduction in Philippines has been much slower than in some neighbouring countries in the region, despite the fact that there's been relatively high economic growth for the region as a whole. So poverty incidence was 28.2% in 2008. And by 2015 it had only dropped to 26.3%. And one reason for this slow reduction in poverty is the exposure to these recurrent and frequent and severe natural disasters. So poverty actually increased after Typhoon Haiyan in 2013. And what we see is that disaster risk is fundamentally associated with poverty in the Philippines. So there's an overlap between the geographical incidence of the natural hazards, especially typhoons, and those regions which have the highest poverty rates. And at the household level, vulnerability of the poorest to these shocks is also higher. So the poorer households tend to lose a higher proportion of their assets and have a low ability to cope with the effects of the crisis. If we look at the figure on the right-hand side, this is taken from a study by the World Bank, and this shows that vulnerability to poverty, meaning being poor at least once in the last 6 years, is much higher than the poverty incidence. So it's 44% of the country that were vulnerable to being poor within 6 years. And many Filipinos live just above the poverty line, so they can easily fall into poverty. You know, you've got this sort of churning or cycling around the poverty line. And a key reason for this is this exposure to these natural disasters. And this is important in the context of what we're discussing here, because it means that the existing poor are not the only people who are vulnerable to or who are badly affected by a natural disaster. Next slide, please. So if we take a look at the social protection system in the country, Philippines has one of the most advanced social protection systems in the East Asia Pacific region. And the Pantawid Programme is the flagship programme in the country. It's implemented by the Department for Social Welfare and Development, who I'll call DSWD from now on. And the programme aims at poverty alleviation and improving the health, the nutrition and the education of poor children. So it's targeted very specifically at poor households with children. So to be eligible, the household must be included in and registered as poor in the National Socioeconomic Registry. And this registry was initially created through implementation of a household poverty survey in 2011, and it's known as the Listahanan in Philippines. And at that time it included about 60% of the population. Since then it's been updated in 2015, and now it includes approximately 75 to 80% of households in the country. So again, we'll come back to this later, but it's not 100% coverage of the population. The programme is conditional, so beneficiaries receive these monthly cash transfers of up to 1,400 pesos. They get these on a bi-monthly basis, conditional on attendance at education and health services and family development sessions, which are held on a monthly basis. Payments are delivered through an ATM card and also through payments by post offices and remittance companies in more isolated parts of the country where the ATM network has poor coverage. And the programme has expanded fairly rapidly. So as of 2015, there were over 4.4 million households who were beneficiaries of Pantawid across the whole country. So it does have national coverage. And basic services, just as we saw in Pakistan, in Philippines, they've been devolved to local government in the country. But Pantawid is a special programme of the President. So this particular programme hasn't been devolved. It's implemented centrally through DSWD, who hire their own social welfare officers who are based in the provinces and the municipalities to support the implementation. Next slide, please. So this slide introduces the disaster risk management system in the Philippines. So since 2010, coordination of disaster risk management has been through this this multidisciplinary structure, the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council. This sits under the Office of the President, and this structure is replicated down to the local level due to devolution. At the national level, you have these 4 vice chairs, and each one chairs a different thematic area of disaster risk management, so response, recovery, preparedness, and prevention. And DSWD, as you see, is the lead agency for disaster response. So they have this mandate as well as the mandate for social protection and for implementation of Pantawid. But the emergency operations are managed within a separate bureau at DSWD. So on paper at least, you can see that the institutional environment in the context of Philippines does offer some potential for social protection systems to respond to disasters. Next slide, please. So now we'll look in more detail at 2013 and the humanitarian response that followed the Typhoon Haiyan. It was the worst disaster in the country's history. It affected some of the country's poorest regions. And in fact, 171 municipalities were badly affected. Over 40% of the total humanitarian response to that disaster was given as cash assistance. And that included interventions across the sectoral areas, so for food security, livelihood recovery, and for shelter. And within this cash response, there was this first, let's say, the first test or the first pilot of shock responsive social protection through World Food Programme's emergency cash transfer. So World Food Programme partnered with DSWD on a pilot. WFP gave their emergency funds to DSWD. These were channeled to Pantawid beneficiaries, to existing Pantawid beneficiaries in the affected areas, and this was through the standard administrative systems on the Pantawid programme. So each social protection beneficiary got an additional cash transfer, a top-up cash transfer of $30 per month that was on top of their regular social protection transfer. And why did WFP do this? It was for several reasons. The first reason is the acknowledgement that the poor are some of the most vulnerable to a disaster and some of the worst affected. The second was that the Pantawid Programme has significant coverage of the affected population. So in some areas that had been badly affected by the typhoon, there was almost half of the affected population being already registered as beneficiaries on this programme, because these are also the poorest areas in the country. So this was seen as a way to rapidly scale up cash assistance to some, not all, but to some of those that were most in need, without having to establish a new parallel system. And WFP managed to reach over 100,000 households in 60 of the worst affected municipalities through this mechanism. And then during the recovery and rehabilitation phase, UNICEF opted to do the same, although on a much smaller scale, with 5,800 households in 5 municipalities. Next slide, please. And just to recap very briefly, so if we look at the typology that you've been introduced to already, these are examples of vertical expansion in the typology. So this idea of increasing the value of the benefit to existing social protection recipients. Next slide. So in the research, we looked quite closely at the lessons learned from these pilot scalings up, and we looked at the enabling factors and also the challenges for shock responsive social protection in Philippines. And what was clear from the research is that this vertical expansion of the Pantawid in the context of Typhoon Haiyan was an efficient and effective way of reaching a significant portion of households who had been affected by an extreme disaster. So for reaching those people who were already registered as social protection beneficiaries, it cost less and it needed less time to implement than setting up a whole parallel system. And there were a number of factors that enabled the smooth implementation of this pilot programme. Firstly, DSWD has the mandate for both social protection and disaster response. And because of this, they had an existing, pre-existing working relationship with WFP for food-based humanitarian responses. And this was a significant enabling factor in getting the pilot off the ground. In terms of political buy-in, the political environment at this time was highly conducive to the success of the project. So there's already clear commitment from the government of Philippines and the structures as a result for disaster risk management and disaster response. There was previous experience of DSWD in collaborating with the humanitarian community on disaster response. And also the unprecedented scale of this particular disaster. This contributed to, let's say, an increased sense of urgency and a willingness on all parties, on the humanitarian side and on the side of the government, to think outside of the box and try new solutions. In terms of the regulatory environment, so what you have on the Pantawid is existing protocols for removing the conditionality on the Pantawid programme during times of calamity. So it effectively became an unconditional cash transfer, which meant that WFP felt that it was reasonable to use this for disaster response. And a key enabling factor is this existing and well-functioning underlying administrative system and structure that the Pantawid programme uses for its operations. And this helped in 2 ways. In terms of identifying the beneficiaries, by topping up the regular cash payments of existing households who are registered as Pantawid recipients, they're already identified, they're already enrolled, and this saved a good deal of time and resources that would usually be spent on, targeting from scratch. And in terms of managing the payment process, so World Food Programme were making use of the standard payment processes of the Pantawid programme, and these are well established, they're well-oiled machines, everyone is familiar with them, beneficiaries know what to do, know where to go to collect the money, delivery partners are familiar with the systems, and so are DSWD. And so this really was key in facilitating a rapid response. And also the local level implementation through the strong network of Pantawid social welfare offices. This was also a crucial factor. At the same time, it wasn't a 100% smooth process, as you can imagine. There were a number of challenges and difficulties faced on the ground. Firstly, the capacity of DSWD. They faced challenges in covering the additional workload that was involved. As you can imagine, their own staff have also been affected by the typhoon in the affected regional offices and the municipalities. So they needed to surge in staff from other areas of the country. They also had to cover some of the operating costs to distribute and reconcile these additional transfers. In terms of delivering electronic payments, some beneficiaries had lost their ATM cards in the typhoon. Some ATM networks were badly affected in some areas and just were not operational. So DSWD took the decision to pay people through one of the over-the-counter direct cash channels instead. And having this flexibility in the payment system, it was a significant enabling factor in addressing this challenge and this constraint. There were also challenges in delivering these cash-in-hand payments. It increased the workload of the over-the-counter payment providers, such as the post office, at a time when also their capacity was affected by the typhoon. There was also a lack of currency in circulation, especially of small notes, small denominations. A key thing to point out, which we'll come back to at the end of the presentation, is the exclusion of some of the disaster affected. So the Pantawid Programme, it has high coverage and it includes a number of the disaster affected areas, but it targets a particular demographic group. So it's targeting poor families that have children, and as such it includes some, but not all, of those who were badly affected by the typhoon and who were in need of humanitarian assistance. So World Food Programme's solution was to coordinate this assistance with assistance that was provided to other households through the, let's say, the more traditional route of INGO implementing partners. And finally, the size of the grants. So World Food Programme's funds, they were, the size of the transfer was designed to meet food needs only. It was a top-up to meet 100% of the household's food requirements during the response to the disaster. But these households had other sectoral needs, other needs for cash as a result of the typhoon besides food. And these basically had to be covered through parallel humanitarian assistance programs from other agencies. And in an ideal world, better coordination between the clusters could potentially have allowed for provision of a larger single transfer to meet other basic needs besides food. So next slide, please. So what does the future hold for shock responsive social protection in Philippines? So there's been a continued and growing interest within the government, within the UN, within the World Bank and the wider humanitarian sector in the country to look at exploring the use of national systems to support a cash-based response in emergencies. Last year, World Bank secured funding for developing what's being called a National Emergency Cash Transfer Programme. So at the time that this research was conducted, which was the middle of 2016, there had been a national workshop on the topic. The design still needs to be agreed and defined. But what was clear coming out of that workshop was the interest in leveraging somehow the Pantawid Programme or its associated administrative systems as a logical starting point for building such a cash transfer programme. And if we look here, there are two, let's say, options from that typology that are on the table. So there's vertical expansion, just as we saw in the case of Typhoon Haiyan, or there's this idea of piggybacking, where you leverage the administrative systems and processes of the Pantawid Programme, but you do so in the process, you design a totally separate, standalone humanitarian cash transfer. It's not linked to the Pantawid Programme in any way. So if we look at vertical expansion first of all, there's opportunities and challenges, as you can expect. So the opportunities are the quick access to a predefined caseload, just as what we saw in Typhoon Haiyan with World Food Programme's experience, and there's also the building on the existing Pantawid administrative systems. In terms of challenges, we've already heard, the Pantawid Programme, first of all, it doesn't include all of the poor, partly because it's not designed to, it's designed to reach poor families only with children, also because it's based on this National Socioeconomic Registry, which is incomplete. It doesn't include 100% of households. And furthermore, this data over time, this data on poverty is inevitably going to go out of date because, as we saw, households cycle around the poverty line. And secondly, it's not going to have complete overlap between Pantawid beneficiaries and those who are affected by disasters. If we look now at piggybacking, the piggybacking approach would have the benefit of leveraging the existing systems on which the Pantawid is based. So that might be the socioeconomic registry for targeting purposes, it might be the payment systems, it could be the staff of the Pantawid programme, in order to reach households quickly and efficiently, but clearly through a separate programme. And another benefit of this approach is that this has the opportunity to include a broader cross-section of those who are disaster affected. So it's not just the Pantawid programme beneficiaries. Again, if we consider the challenges as well, whilst the socioeconomic registry is a good starting point, it's definitely important to consider the limitations of this database, of this registry. As I mentioned before, it's not including 100% of the population, and the data over time, unless there are provisions put in place for the regular updating of that data, is not going to be as relevant as it is at the time of its development. So this data was collated in 2015. We're already into 2017. As a rule, internationally, we see that these poverty registries are not updated particularly frequently. So this is something to bear in mind. There also needs to be consideration for exactly how that database is used to inform a humanitarian response. Is it going to be just a starting point for further verification of those who have been affected by the disaster, or is it to enable the identification of, let's say, a predefined caseload for a humanitarian response, either by saying that the assumption that the poor are the most vulnerable, or the poor and the near poor are the most vulnerable. And this would have implications for both the speed in which the response could be implemented, but also the accuracy of that response. So it is an area that needs some strong consideration. And any such programme would require sort of clear standard operating procedures and strong coordination between all of the institutions. There's a few other issues that it's worth just pointing out, and the report goes into further detail on these. In terms of coordination, we mentioned before the Philippines has this, let's say, slightly unusual institutional setup in that you have the same government agency who's leading on coordination of social protection and coordination of humanitarian response. And this is an opportunity for integrated thinking and programming, but these are in different divisions of the same ministry. They don't necessarily talk to each other, and you would have to have coordination mechanisms defined, as well as coordination mechanisms that link to the wider humanitarian sector, who would also be delivering some complementary cash and in-kind assistance. There's the issue of preparedness. It's going to be clearly important for the operational processes of any national emergency cash transfer to be clearly set out in a manual, and everyone be trained on their roles and responsibilities for smooth implementation at the time of a crisis. There's also this question of which humanitarian needs you would include in such an emergency cash transfer. Would it just be food? Would it be food and basic needs? Would it be other needs that are seen regularly in Philippines as a result of natural disasters, such as the need for shelter reconstruction or livelihoods recovery, because these have implications for targeting purposes as well. And then finally, just a point on political economy issues and sustainability. So the Pantawid programme isn't enshrined in legislation in Philippines. It's a special programme of the President. Future administrations could potentially reduce support for the programme or even abolish the programme. So this has implications if we're thinking of relying on those systems for disaster response. So I'll leave it there. This has been a great opportunity to present some of the findings, and the report is going to be out in the coming weeks, and I'll hand back over now to take some questions.
I've been collating that for long. I'm going to start with one question which cuts across, which is about scaling down. So imagine kind of there's been a process of vertical or horizontal expansion or an external program piggybacking on existing systems and it kind of in a post-disaster. So how to deal with expectations when scaling down, how to kind of think of this program, whether it should be conceived as a multi-year entitlement and kind of how to set the transfer amount. So those are some of the questions that kind of as a first round of questions around that. And I'll maybe start with Carol and then Gabby quickly.
Yes, I mean, that's a good question, and that was really raised quite a lot in our consultations in Pakistan. The idea that particularly if you are doing either the vertical or the horizontal, the vertical top-ups or the horizontal expansion of a program that's actually designed for a certain number of beneficiaries and either gives more for a temporary period after disaster or expands to more beneficiaries during the disaster response. And I think many of our informants really pointed to some of the dangers of this and the raising of the expectations and the need for clear communications and administrative systems to record who's coming in and off, but really primarily the communications aspect to communicate that this is a temporary, either a top-up or an expansion. And that has to be known from the outset. It has to be built in as a temporary piece because it builds onto a system. For example, the BISP in Pakistan is a multi-year entitlement for the chronically poor, and it has no cutoff at the moment until they're now redoing the NSCR and the national poverty sort of assessment, but the people who are on it over multi-years. And so if you do use even BISP as a program or even some of these operating systems, it has to be very clearly communicated that the post-disaster response is a temporary program.
Gabby, we can't hear you. Microphone, sorry.
Is that, am I on now? Yeah. I was just saying, just to reiterate what I was saying, the report of Philippines goes into more detail about some of these operational issues than perhaps some of the other research reports do, because it has the previous experience, the previous experience from these pilots. Certainly temporary horizontal expansion of the Pantawid Programme was not an option that many stakeholders wanted to consider, because they were worried that this issue of increasing the coverage of the Pantawid Programme, relaxing the eligibility criteria to include more people at times of disaster, and then the potential challenge of exiting those people from the programme in future months would create challenges and potentially would even undermine the legitimacy politically or with the public of the standard Pantawid social protection programme. So this is a real key issue to think about, I think, with horizontal expansion, not just within Philippines but also more broadly. And in terms of setting the value of the transfer, again, the report goes into more detail, but I touched on it when I was just speaking now. This issue of which humanitarian needs you plan to include in any shock responsive social protection program. And I think that also depends on the type of emergency or type of disaster that you are responding to. Perhaps in the case of, for example, I'm thinking aloud, but drought, we can say quite clearly that it's going to be to respond, at least in the the early acute phase, to food needs, food and nutrition and water. Whereas in the case of a natural disaster such as a typhoon, there is all these additional issues with shelter reconstruction. But the frequency and the value of these transfers are not the same as the frequency and the value of the transfers that you would deliver for recurrent basic needs. So this was part of the discussion that was going on in Philippines last year when we were undertaking the research.
Sorry, my system froze. Okay, I'm here. So there's 3 questions, very interesting questions around the use of existing databases. So in Pakistan, the National Social Economic Registry, and in the Philippines, the equivalent Lista Hanan. I just want to kind of tell viewers that this is one of the aspects we'll be really drilling it down into kind of in the synthesis report, because it has been the most important issue that's come out of most countries, because of those 5 typologies, most of them incorporate some element of using the existing data from existing social protection programs. So the questions I have for you two are around, first of all, when we're using existing databases, you've both mentioned that there's always going to be a component of people left out by definition. If you're just targeting existing beneficiaries, then it will depend on who the beneficiaries are, and if you're using existing databases even of non-beneficiaries, it will depend on what percentage of the population is covered in. So how does one deal with excluded people? So that's question number 1, and then question number 2, which comes from the Pakistan perspective especially, is what about difficulties getting access to data when there's a cost to accessing data? Wouldn't that jeopardize piggybacking, especially for external actors? So I'll hand over to Carol first. Thanks.
Yes, these are really very good questions and really big issues to deal with. I think what's important to note in the Pakistan case is the NSER is, of course, the national registry. It's not the BISP beneficiary database. BISP beneficiaries are a subset of that based on a PMT, a poverty proxy means test for sort of a type of poverty targeting. So at the moment it covers 85%. It is outdated. It was 2011. It is being updated now, and they're experimenting with different ways of how best to update it. And interestingly enough, just as an aside, there's some indications that there'll be indicators for geolocation or geography, which could really lead to targeting of disaster-prone households who are living in those geographic areas that have already been mapped out in that multivariate mapping that the DRM system does. So I think the issue maybe goes to, at the moment, the computerized national identity cards, the CNIC, that are linked to the National Socioeconomic Registry are really, they at least have basic identities of people. Now the poverty levels will, of course, fluctuate, or the assets, the characteristics of those households will fluctuate according to years. And so the big question is, how often can you really update these? Can it be done on a come in as you are and update your CNIC information in the registry, and then see if you're, you can update your data. But I think the issues were well understood. Both the use of the National Socioeconomic Registry and the hope that in the future, now that it's planned to cover up to 95%, we were told in the new iteration, will be within the registry. And then so how do you best make use of that, and how do you establish those standard operating procedures for the sharing of the data from that registry, which is of course sensitive because it's linked to the national identity system. But within the contours of the National Social Protection Policy Framework, and with this, there is some sense of establishing this sort of super this entity that's sort of not part of this, that would be responsible for that database, and therefore it would be something that would be more or less neutral and would clearly be linked into the socioeconomic registry process of updating. So I think there's a lot of consideration being given to this, and a lot of moves forward into thinking the way through of how to perfect it.
Yeah, so just to build on what Carol said, I won't duplicate, but in the context of Philippines, the same discussions have been going on. One issue to point out, which is mentioned in the report, is this issue of data protection. So there's been some changes to the regulations around data protection, which at the time of doing the research last year it was still unclear, but it was restricting the use of the list to Haiyan data by other actors, let's say external to DSWD, such as UN OCHA. This is something that, again, clearly needs to be well defined in some SOPs if we do want to move forward with using such registers for additional uses beyond social protection, and certainly if we want to use them in a timely fashion for disaster response. The other issue is around the way in which you make use of these databases and the data therein to inform your humanitarian response programs. I touched on it when we were talking before, but there's two very different ways that you can make use of that data. There's taking the data and looking at those who are defined as poor or perhaps near poor, making the link to the fact that the poor are some of, not all, but some of the most vulnerable to a disaster, and therefore setting some rules in place to say that, okay, these are a predefined caseload in the event of, let's say, perhaps a category 3 emergency where we will immediately provide humanitarian assistance to households registered as poor or near poor in this database, because we understand that they are going to be some of the worst affected, and it's better to be safe than sorry. Or there is the alternative of taking the data from these databases, going beyond wealth categories, and taking that as a starting point for further analysis and targeting after a disaster has hit. They have pros and cons, and they are both going to be contingent on the accuracy of the data. The one where we talk about the link between poverty and vulnerability to disasters is obviously contingent on the accuracy of that poverty targeting in the first place and the age of the data, because over time that data is going to become increasingly inaccurate. But even if we're taking the data just as a starting point for further verification, contact details are likely to go out of date over time, especially in places such as we saw in Pakistan, where there's high mobility and migration between locations. So this idea of having some sort of dynamic registry or opportunities for either households themselves or other users of that data. Let's say you do set up a program where someone is able to use the data to implement a separate program to piggyback on that database. If you establish two-way protocols for sharing that data so that this independent agency is mandated to send back data to the National Registry and to enable that database to be regularly updated, especially around people's contact details and identification information. I think these are the sorts of things that all have to be discussed in detail and protocols established.
Hello? Sorry, my webinar software has been crashing consistently, so can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to lump two quite different questions together a second.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my, help, sorry. Hello?
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you.
So I'm going to lump two quite different questions together. One is about funding. So there's an interesting question about how often humanitarian response and long-term social protection have different funding streams with clearly earmarked budgets that are often not flexible and that don't permit those two areas to work together. So whether there's any experience coming out from Pakistan or Philippines showing how this challenge might be overcome, especially in contexts where there's no clear coordination. And a second question around the adequacy of cash top-up specifically in post-disaster situations where markets might have been affected, and so whether kind of that's a consideration and how that should be kept in mind. I do have quite a few other very technical questions that we're going to be answering once the webinar is over, we'll be sending out written answers to these questions and posting them on the online community, because some of them are a bit too technical for the webinar, very specific. So let's answer these last two questions, and we might want to wrap up after that. Thanks.
But maybe I'll address the second of the questions. First, the adequacy of cash. We fully agree that it's not always the most appropriate, particularly if markets are not there, that there's other forms of assistance. So we just chose to focus on it in our country study, but we don't negate the fact that there are other needs as well. There was seemingly some consensus that in most of the disasters that Pakistan has been through, that cash was a very effective way of addressing it. But I think, as we showed on our last slide, you really need to do an analysis to make sure it's an appropriate response as you move forward.
Hi, this is Gabby. Yeah, just to reiterate on the cash and markets question, yeah, the same thing came up in the Philippines case study. Clearly, in order for you to undertake a shock response through social protection, which is cash-based, the preconditions for cash and emergencies need to be in place. One of those preconditions is whether markets are functioning and accessible. And this is a topic that DSWD were actually receiving, let's say, training and capacity building on from humanitarian actors, from the Cash Learning Partnership and from WFP Programme, amongst others. And DSWD are also a member of the Cash Working Group in Philippines. So it's about linking together humanitarian expertise and social protection expertise to be able to understand the preconditions and the requirements for cash in emergencies, because they are slightly different. In terms of the funding, so in the case of Philippines, this program was funded through humanitarian money that came through WFP's channels and then was transferred to DSWD. I think everyone acknowledges that this type of intervention was reliant on humanitarian funding streams, which are not secure and can take time to arrive during appeals. So in the workshops of last year, there was clear engagement on the at least the recognition of the need to look beyond humanitarian funding streams to something more reliable and predictable. And there's work again that the World Bank is leading in Philippines on looking at more innovative financial instruments for funding responses following calamities, such things as disaster bonds and insurance products. The Philippines report touches on them, and also the literature review which goes with this research has an extensive section on financing instruments if people are interested.
Okay. Yes, please.
I'm sorry, because I didn't answer the second question. In Pakistan, certainly the most of our consultations, the issue was around developing a national disaster risk financing strategy, and so therefore foreseeing the need for pre-positioning finances for the disaster response. It was more in that sense. The sort of the humanitarian system gets kicked in through the appeals process, which is only at a certain level, whereas this round of disasters is also something nationally that the government is trying to work out a national disaster financing strategy for that.
Right. It crashed again and I'm here again. So to wrap up, there's one last slightly provocative or kind of question just to get your view based on your research in these two countries of which of the 5 main mechanisms that we've described in the initial typology, which do you feel is the most effective in a short period of time to reach a significant amount of households in the aftermath of a shock? And I'm going to leave you to answer this question, and I want to tell everybody that we will be answering all the other questions. Thank you very much for submitting them. We will be answering them in written format, and we'll be posting the link to this webinar online, and please share it with your net, anyone who might be interested. And thank you very much for attending on my side. I'll hand over to the two respondents to close down the webinar.
Well, it is a provocative question. I think there's not really an either or, and I think the question has to be phrased, is it the rapid or is it the systems that you're looking into? And I think that certainly in terms of the building up incrementally into a system that you have the interface between disaster response and social protection, this piggybacking model seems to be quite a good systemic kind of way forward to build up those systems in both sectors. Of course, in a rapid response, you would want to, all response possible. So I think my feeling and the findings I think from Pakistan suggest that it's not always either or, that there's room for a lot of different responses depending on the nature of the disaster, depending on the national or provincial or local level capacities, depending on the actors in place, the prepositioning of systems and such. So I think that would be my response from the Pakistan side.
From my side, I guess I've also been leading on the literature review for this OPM study, which looks at previous experiences beyond these 6 countries much more broadly. So I guess I'm trying to bring that experience in as well. I think in a disaster, the one that's been most commonly used so far has been vertical, but the piggybacking option really, I think, does hold potential. But ultimately, all of this comes down, as Carol says, to context, and it comes down to design. I think in the case of horizontal, if you look at East Africa, we have the examples from Kenya, from Ethiopia now, of where these programs do seem to be fairly successful at scaling up vertically and horizontally. But I think the difference is these programs they were designed to do this. PSMP almost from the outset, Hunger Safety Nets program from phase 2. I think that's a very different thing to thinking that you can just do this sort of, almost on spec to a program that has a different objective, and which is poverty alleviation rather than disaster response. So if we internationally, if we are interested in looking closely at the potential for social protection systems to respond whether vertically or horizontally, we need to be upfront and explicit about this from the within the design documents of the national program, and expand those operational procedures to accommodate this. So and be clear on sensitization that these programs have this additional expected function. If we're not, or if governments are not, willing or able to do that, then I think piggybacking holds the most potential.
Brilliant. So we've gone beyond our half-hour mark. It's now 9:30 in the UK and other times in other parts of the world. So thank you so much to both of you for your time and dedication to this. Please, everyone who's listening, look out for our the reports will be slowly they're being published online. And our synthesis report will be written up in the next couple of months, including kind of a framework to analyze these issues across these different countries. And we will be having a webinar next week in Spanish, but which is probably not relevant to any of you, on the experiences in Latin America. So thank you very much to everyone, and yeah, look out for us on the community page and on our website. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.